I worked 65-hour weeks for 15 years to build my wife's dad's restaurant empire. He fired Mu Epsilon Alpha Tau 45. You're too old. Broke. I went to close my childhood savings account. IT had $500 in 1985. The teller went pale. Sir, this account has an automatic stock purchase plan attached to it from 30 years ago. She printed the statement. What I saw made my knees buckle, but the stock company name made me realize my parents knew something I didn't. My name's Marcus Hale, and I used to think loyalty was like compound interest. The longer you stayed, the more it paid off. Turns out loyalty is more like milk in the back of the fridge. It expires when you're not looking, and by the time you notice, it's already gone sour and nobody wants to deal with the smell. Spoiler alert, I was the expired milk, and my father-in-law Dominic Ferraro was the guy holding his nose while tossing me in the trash. For 15 years, count him, 15 whole years, I worked an average of 65 hours a week for Dominic, a man who genuinely believed that yelling in Italian made him sound more authentic. Even though he was born in Cleveland and the closest he'd been to Italy was the Olive Garden on Euclid Avenue. Don't get me wrong, the man could cook, but his idea of old country charm was mostly just volume control issues and a strategic use of hand gestures that would make a traffic cop jealous. Together, and I mean together in the sense that I did about 90% of the actual work, we turned his sad little one-location pizza joint into a 5-restaurant empire that stretched across 3 counties. I was the operations manager, the handyman, the unpaid therapist for every drama-filled employee who walked through those kitchen doors, and the unofficial fire marshal who kept the health inspector from shutting us down at least a dozen times. Dominic used to slap me on the back with his meaty hand, usually right between my shoulder blades, which I'm pretty sure gave me permanent spinal damage, and say with this big grin, "Marcus, you're not just family, you are family." The first time he said it, I actually felt something. Pride, maybe. Belonging. The warm fuzzies you get when someone validates your existence. But somewhere around year 3, I started to realize that in Ferraro language, your family was just corporate speak for free labor until further notice. And also you're never getting a raise because we're blood now, and blood doesn't charge blood over time. I knew every single sauce recipe by heart, including this secret marinara that was basically just crushed tomatoes, garlic, and Dominic's ego. I knew every supplier from the produce guy who showed up at 5 in the morning smelling like cigarettes and regret, to the meat distributor who always tried to upsell us on premium sausage we definitely couldn't afford. I knew every grease trap in that empire. And trust me, if you've never had the pleasure of clearing a commercial grease trap at 2 in the morning because the Saturday dinner rush clogged it up, you haven't truly experienced the glamorous life of restaurant management. I'd crawled under sinks, rewired walk-in freezers with YouTube tutorials playing on my cracked phone screen, and once, I'm not proud of this, I duct-taped a broken oven door shut for an entire Friday night service because Dominic refused to call a repairman until after the weekend rush. I skipped birthdays. My daughter Zoe had at least 4 parties where I showed up an hour late covered in flour and smelling like pepperoni, holding a grocery store cake because I'd forgotten to order a real one. I skipped vacations because who the hell takes a vacation when you're building an empire, right? Clara would book something, a weekend in the Poconos, a trip to Niagara Falls, anything to get away. And I'd cancel it the week before because Dominic would suddenly need me to open a new location or train a manager who inevitably quit after 3 weeks because, surprise, working for the Ferraros was like signing up for boot camp with worse food. I skipped sleep on a semi-permanent basis, surviving on gas station coffee and those little 5-hour energy shots that probably took 5 years off my life expectancy. All of this, every missed soccer game, every anniversary dinner where I showed up late or not at all, every time Clara asked me if I was okay and I lied through my teeth, was to make Dominic's dream work. Not my dream, his. I was the guy making someone else's vision come true while my own life played out in the background like elevator music nobody actually listens to. My wife Clara used to call me the backbone of the operation, which I took as a compliment until I really thought about it one night while scrubbing industrial-sized pots at midnight. Turns out, I wasn't the backbone at all. I was just the disposable spine, the thing that holds everything together until something better comes along, and then gets tossed out without a second thought. I remember the day I installed the point-of-sale system at the 3rd location. Spent 16 straight hours programming that thing, setting up the printer, training the staff, and troubleshooting why the credit card reader kept rejecting transactions. Dominic showed up at the end of my shift, took one look at the functioning system, and said, "See, this is what family does." He didn't offer to help. He didn't bring me dinner. He didn't even ask if I needed a break. He just observed my exhaustion like it was performance art and patted himself on the back for having the wisdom to marry his daughter off to someone who knew his way around a circuit board. The worst part wasn't even the work itself. I actually liked solving problems, fixing things, making systems run smoothly. The worst part was the slowly dawning realization that I'd become one of those guys you see in movies, the loyal sidekick who does all the heavy lifting while the main character takes all the credit and gets the girl. Except in my case, I already had the girl, and she was getting increasingly tired of being a restaurant widow. Clara stopped asking me to come to bed at a reasonable hour. She stopped suggesting date nights. She just adapted to my absence the way you adapt to a crack in the ceiling. You notice it at first, then eventually it just becomes part of the scenery. I used to tell myself it would pay off, that someday Dominic would recognize everything I'd done and cut me in as a real partner, not just the son-in-law who fixed the toilets and did the books. I used to think that 15 years of loyalty, of showing up when nobody else would, of bleeding for this business, had to count for something. I used to think that in America, hard work and dedication actually meant something beyond a firm handshake and a "thanks, buddy," that sounded more like a dismissal than gratitude. I was wrong about all of it. Turns out loyalty doesn't compound. It just makes you an easier target when it's time to clean house and make room for the next generation of people who think hashtags are a business strategy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That revelation was still a few chapters away, right around the time I learned that family isn't defined by blood or marriage, but by who shows up when everything falls apart. And spoiler alert, it wasn't the Ferraros. It happened on a Thursday, which is fitting because Thursdays are the most mediocre day of the week. Not quite hump day, not quite Friday, just this bland stretch of calendar real estate where bad news feels right at home. The whole restaurant smelled like betrayal mixed with garlic bread, which honestly should have been my first clue that something was off, because normally Thursdays smelled like pepperoni and broken dreams. But that morning, there was this weird energy in the air, like when you walk into a surprise party except everyone's surprised face is actually just poorly disguised pity. I'd gotten to work at 6 in the morning like I always did, going through the produce delivery and noticing that our tomato guy had tried to slip us some questionable Roma tomatoes that looked like they'd been through a divorce. I was in the middle of drafting a strongly worded text about quality control when my phone buzzed with a message from Dominic. Office. 10 a.m. Important. No emoji, no exclamation point, no please, or when you get a chance. Just a command that made my stomach do this uncomfortable flip that I tried to ignore by drinking more coffee and telling myself I was being paranoid. At 9:55 a.m., I knocked on Dominic's office door, which was really just a converted storage room that still smelled faintly like industrial cleaning supplies no matter how many times he sprayed that cologne that probably cost more than my car payment. He called out, "Come in that tone that people use when they're about to tell you your dog died, or your wife is cheating on you, or in this case, your entire professional identity is about to be flushed down the toilet like expired marinara. I walked in and immediately clocked the setup. Dominic sat behind that oversized mahogany desk that I'd found for him on clearance at some warehouse sale in Akron, 70% off because it had a scratch on the side that you could barely see if you weren't looking for it. But he'd spent the last 3 years telling everyone who'd listened that it was imported from Milan by some third-generation Italian craftsman who only worked during full moons or whatever story made him sound more cultured. The desk was covered in paperwork that looked official and threatening, the kind of documents that have words like restructuring and severance printed in fonts that are trying way too hard to look friendly. But the real kicker was seeing Luca sitting in the chair next to Dominic's desk, wearing designer jeans that probably cost more than my mortgage and a smirk that suggested he knew exactly why I was there and was enjoying it way too much. Luca Ferraro, Dominic's 27-year-old golden child, trust fund philosopher, and living proof that nepotism is alive and well in the American restaurant industry. This kid, and I say kid because anyone who still posts gym selfies with captions like #grindtime and #beast mode, is a kid regardless of their birth certificate. Thought running a business meant showing up twice a week, taking pictures of food he didn't cook, and explaining to anyone who'd listen that his business degree from a university his dad donated a new kitchen to made him qualified to reinvent the wheel. Marcus, Dominic said with this heavy sigh that sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it in the mirror while shaving that morning. Sit down. We need to talk. Nobody in the history of human communication has ever followed, "We need to talk," with good news. That phrase is the verbal equivalent of a cancer diagnosis. I sat down in the cheap folding chair they'd placed in front of the desk. Not the nice leather guest chair, but the wobbly metal one we usually reserved for employees we were about to fire for stealing or showing up drunk. And I knew right then that I was royally screwed. "You've done good work," Dominic continued, and I wanted to interrupt him right there and say good work doesn't cover 15 years of bleeding for this company. But I kept my mouth shut because I still had this tiny sliver of hope that maybe this was about something else. Maybe they were promoting me or giving me a raise or literally anything other than what was obviously about to happen. But Marcus, the industry is changing. We need fresh ideas, social media presence, influencers. We need people who understand TikTok and Instagram Reels and all this new marketing stuff that, frankly, I don't get either. But Luca here. He gestured at his son like he was presenting a prize on a game show. Luca's been explaining to me that we need to pivot our brand strategy. Pivot our brand strategy. I wanted to laugh, but it came out as this weird, choking sound that I tried to pass off as clearing my throat. This was the same man who 3 years ago asked me what the Twitter was and whether we needed to be worried about it. Now he was talking about brand pivots like he'd invented the concept. "I can learn TikTok," I said, and I heard the desperation in my voice but couldn't stop it. "Heck, I can learn Morse code if it pays the bills. I learned how to repair industrial freezers off YouTube. I can figure out how to point a camera at food and add music." I was grasping at straws and we all knew it. But what else was I supposed to do? Roll over and accept extinction? Luca leaned forward with this smile that I wanted to wipe off his face with the back of my hand. "Marcus, my guy, it's not really about learning. It's about being." He paused for dramatic effect like he was about to drop some profound wisdom instead of corporate buzzword garbage. "It's about being relevant, you know? Like, having that natural understanding of what resonates with the demographic we're trying to reach. The 18 to 34 market doesn't want to see, like, someone's dad trying to be cool on the internet. No offense. None taken. I lied, taking all the offense. Every single bit of it." "What Luca means," Dominic jumped in, probably sensing that I was about 3 seconds from saying something that would burn every bridge in the greater Cleveland area, "is that we need someone who grew up with this technology. Someone who speaks the language naturally. You're a great guy, Marcus. Hell, your family. But we need to think about the future of these restaurants." That's how I learned that at 45 years old, I was officially a dinosaur, apparently born before relevance was invented, before the magical year when understanding TikTok became more valuable than actually knowing how to run a business. Never mind that I'd kept these restaurants from going under during the pandemic. Never mind that I'd figured out delivery logistics, negotiated with suppliers, and kept the health inspector happy for a decade and a half. None of that mattered because I didn't know how to do a trending dance while holding a pizza. Dominic slid an envelope across the desk, and I didn't need to open it to know what it was. "It's a severance package," he said. 3 months' salary. We think that's more than fair given the circumstances." 3 months' salary. I did the math in my head and realized it wouldn't even cover a used scooter, let alone the mortgage, car payments, Zoe's braces, and the mountain of bills that seemed to multiply like rabbits every month. "This is business, Marcus," Dominic said, using that tone people use when they're trying to convince themselves they're not being complete monsters. "Nothing personal, right? Because destroying someone's livelihood, career, and financial stability before lunch is the most impersonal thing you can do." I took the envelope, stood up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and walked out of that office without saying another word. Because if I'd opened my mouth, I would have said things that couldn't be unsaid, and I still had enough pride left to leave with some dignity intact. But inside, I was screaming. I packed my entire professional life into one pathetically sad cardboard box that still had tomato paste, 24 cans printed on the side in faded red letters, because apparently even my departure had to be secondhand and recycled. 15 years of my existence condensed into a container that used to hold ingredients for marinara sauce. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I'm pretty sure the universe was having a good laugh at my expense. Inside that box went the family photos I'd kept on my desk, the ones of Zoe's soccer games I'd mostly missed, and Clara smiling in pictures from vacations we'd canceled. There was my lucky spatula, the one I'd used to flip the first pizza at our second location and had kept as some kind of talisman against failure, which clearly hadn't worked. And of course, there was the #1 manager mug I'd bought myself 3 years ago at Target, because nobody else was going to give me a trophy for working myself into an early grave. The office, my office for the better part of a decade, suddenly looked bigger and emptier than it ever had before, like one of those crime scene photos where they've removed all the furniture and you can finally see the stains on the carpet that were always there, but nobody noticed. I'd spent so many late nights in this room, eating cold leftovers at the desk while going through invoices, making phone calls to angry suppliers, scheduling shifts for employees who called in sick more often than they showed up. There was the coffee ring on the corner of the desk from that time I'd pulled an all-nighter during tax season. The small dent in the wall from when I'd thrown a stapler in frustration after our third manager quit in a month. All these little archaeological layers of my life that nobody would remember or care about once I walked out the door. I heard a knock and looked up to see Marcy, one of our veteran servers who'd been with us since location number 2. She was in her mid-50s, had 3 kids in college, and was probably the most competent human being I'd ever worked with. "Marcus," she said quietly, hovering in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. I heard, "This is bullshit." There was something about the way she said it. Not loud, not dramatic, just matter of fact. That almost broke me. I'd been holding it together pretty well up until that point, operating on autopilot and emotional numbness, but genuine sympathy from someone who actually understood what I'd put into this place was like a crack in the dam. "Yeah, well," I managed to say, forcing what I hoped looked like a smile, but probably came across as more of a grimace. "Apparently, I'm too old to understand TikTok, so my services are no longer required. They need someone who can dance while holding a calzone." Marcy shook her head and walked in, closing the door behind her. "Luca's an idiot," she whispered, even though there was nobody around to hear. "He showed up last week and tried to explain to me how to upsell desserts." Me. I've been upselling desserts since he was in diapers. He told me I should try to create an experience for customers. I've been creating experiences. They're called keeping your drink filled and not spitting in your food when you're rude. I laughed, and it felt good to laugh, even though everything else felt terrible. "What are they going to do with this place?" I asked, gesturing around at the office that wouldn't be mine in about 10 minutes. She shrugged. "Luca's moving in. He told Roberto yesterday that he's going to redesign it to be more collaborative and energy positive. Whatever that means. Probably bean bags and motivational posters." The image of Luca sitting on a bean bag in my office, taking selfies with his kale smoothie while the restaurants burned down around him, was almost too perfect. "Well," I said, picking up my sad box of belongings, "I hope he enjoys it. Tell him the coffee maker on the left is broken, but if you hit it twice on the side, it'll work for exactly 1 cup before dying again." As I walked through the kitchen toward the exit, I could feel eyes on me. The line cooks who'd trusted me to approve their time-off requests. The dishwashers I'd fought to get raises for. The prep crew that came in at 4 in the morning and knew I'd be there too, working alongside them instead of sitting in an office like I was too important to get my hands dirty. A few people nodded at me. Some looked away like unemployment was contagious. Manuel, one of our best sauté cooks, stopped me near the walk-in freezer. "This is wrong, boss," he said in his thick accent. "You built this place. Everybody knows it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and kept walking, because if I stopped I might actually lose it completely, and I'd rather cry in my car like a dignified person instead of in front of the industrial dishwasher. When I got to the back door, I saw Damon, the new security guard they'd hired about 6 months ago after someone broke into the 3rd location and stole literally just the tip jar and a cheese grater. Damon was maybe 30, built like he used to play college football before an injury derailed his dreams, and he had this way of seeing through people's bullshit that I'd always appreciated. He took one look at me, at the box in my hands, at the expression on my face that I wasn't hiding as well as I thought I was, and gave me the nod. "You know the one. That universal male acknowledgement of suffering that says, 'I see you, brother, and this sucks, and I've been there, and there's nothing I can say that'll make it better, but I want you to know that I recognize your pain. It was the kind of nod you give at funerals, or after particularly devastating sports losses, or when someone's marriage falls apart. Been there, man, Damon said quietly as he held the door open for me. If you need a reference or anything, you let me know. You were always good people. The drive home took 20 minutes, but felt like 20 hours. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, thinking of all the things I should have said, all the ways I could have handled it differently, even though deep down I knew there was no version of that conversation that ended well for me. I'd been fired, let go, made redundant, given my walking papers. However you wanted to phrase it, the result was the same. I was unemployed at 45 with a mortgage, a car payment, a teenager who needed braces adjusted every 6 weeks, and exactly zero job prospects because apparently my entire skill set had become obsolete overnight. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at our house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch that we bought 12 years ago and still hadn't finished painting, and tried to figure out how to walk through that door and tell my wife that her father had just destroyed our financial stability. Clara's car was in the driveway, which meant she was home, probably folding laundry or meal prepping or doing one of the 1,000 domestic tasks she handled while also working part-time at the library because my restaurant salary barely covered our expenses even when I was employed. I finally grabbed my box of broken promises and walked inside. Clara was in the living room, folding towels in that methodical way she had, each fold precise and exact, like if she could just control the laundry, maybe she could control everything else in our lives. She looked up when she heard the door, saw me standing there in the middle of the afternoon when I should have been at work for at least another 6 hours, saw the box, and I watched her face go through this whole journey of emotions in about 3 seconds flat. Confusion, concern, realization, dread. "Please tell me you finally quit so we can move to Bali," she said. And I could hear the hope in her voice even though we both knew we couldn't afford to move to Bali or anywhere else for that matter. "Close," I said, setting the box down on the coffee table with a thud that felt heavier than it should have. "Dominic fired me so Luca can vlog his way into bankruptcy." Her jaw literally dropped. Like in movies when someone gets shocking news and their mouth just falls open because their brain can't process words anymore. "He fired his son-in-law?" She said it like she couldn't believe it, even though we'd both seen how Dominic operated for years, how family was just a convenient excuse until it wasn't convenient anymore. "Apparently, I expired faster than his marinara sauce," I said, and then I sat down on the couch because my legs suddenly felt like they couldn't hold me up anymore. That night, after Clara had called her mother and yelled for 45 minutes in Italian, which I didn't understand but definitely appreciated, I sat on that same couch eating cold pizza that I'd grabbed from the restaurant on my way out, my last free perk from a job that had taken everything and given me a severance package that wouldn't buy dignity. I stared at the wall, at the spot where we'd always said we'd hang a nice piece of art, but never got around to it, and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. 15 years gone, just like that, and I didn't even get to keep my parking spot. I started sending out resumes approximately 12 hours after getting fired, because apparently my coping mechanism for existential crisis is productivity, which my therapist, if I could afford a therapist, which I definitely couldn't anymore, would probably say is just another form of avoidance. But who cares about healthy emotional processing when you've got bills that don't pause for your mental health journey? I created accounts on Indeed, LinkedIn, Monster, ZipRecruiter, and about 17 other job sites that all asked for the same information in slightly different formats, like some kind of bureaucratic torture designed to break your spirit before you even get to the interview stage. My resume looked pretty impressive on paper, I'm not gonna lie. 15 years of operations management experience. Grew a business from 1 location to 5. Expertise in supply chain logistics, staff management, financial oversight, crisis management, and apparently being a doormat, though I left that last part off the official version. I tailored that bad boy for every single application. Management positions, retail supervisor roles, logistics coordinator jobs, warehouse operations, even a position at a gym that needed someone to manage their protein shake bar, which felt like a significant step down, but beggars can't be choosers, and I needed to choose literally anything that came with a paycheck and health insurance. I sent out resumes like they were confetti at a parade, just throwing them everywhere and hoping something would stick. Restaurant management? Applied. Retail operations? Applied. Hotel supervisor? Why not? Supply chain analyst? Sure, I can analyze chains. Office manager at a dental practice? I don't know anything about teeth, but I'm a fast learner. Executive assistant? I can assist executives so hard they won't know what hit them. Dog walking service manager? Listen, I was genuinely ready to sell snow to penguins if it meant keeping the lights on and Zoe in braces that were apparently made of gold based on what the orthodontist charged every month. The first week, I was optimistic. I told myself it was just a numbers game. Send out enough applications, and eventually something would hit. I had experience, work ethic, references from people who weren't my father-in-law. How hard could it be? Week 2, the optimism started cracking around the edges like cheap paint on a rental apartment wall. Week 3, I was checking my email every 14 seconds like some kind of refresh button addict, hoping for literally anything that wasn't another automated rejection or a scam offering to make me a cryptocurrency millionaire if I just sent them my social security number and firstborn child. The rejections all said basically the same thing, just worded differently like they'd all gone to the same seminar on how to crush people's dreams politely. Thank you for your interest in the assistant manager position at Walmart. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with another candidate whose experience better aligns with our current needs. Translation: we hired someone younger who will work for less money and won't question why we're scheduling them for 39 hours a week to avoid giving them full-time benefits. We appreciate you taking the time to apply for the operations supervisor role at Target. Unfortunately, we've selected a candidate whose qualifications more closely match our requirements. Translation: we Googled you, saw your age, and decided you're probably going to ask for vacation days and reasonable working conditions. My favorite rejection, and by favorite I mean the one that made me want to throw my laptop through the window, came from a hotel chain that was looking for a front desk manager. I'd made it through 3 rounds of interviews, met with the regional manager, did a whole presentation on how I'd improve their customer service scores, and felt pretty damn good about my chances. Then I got the email. While we were impressed with your experience and presentation, we've decided to pursue other candidates who we feel bring a fresh perspective to the role. Fresh perspective. That's corporate speak for young person who doesn't remember a world before smartphones and will work themselves to death because they think that's normal. But the absolute worst was the phone call I got from an HR manager at a logistics company. I'd applied for an operations coordinator position that paid about 60% of what I used to make, which should tell you how desperate I was getting. The woman on the phone, let's call her Brenda because she sounded exactly like every Brenda who's ever worked in HR, had this voice that was trying so hard to sound sympathetic that it actually came out condescending. "Marcus," she said, and I could practically hear her reading from a script. "You seem like a really great candidate with solid experience. But I have to be honest with you. My boss has some concerns about hiring someone at your experience level for this particular role." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer because by this point I'd had enough rejections to recognize the pattern. There was this pause on the other end, the kind of silence that means someone is trying to figure out how to say something terrible in a way that won't get them sued. "Well," Brenda finally said, "he feels that candidates with more years of experience sometimes lack the adaptability and technological fluency that younger candidates bring to the table. He's concerned you might be set in your ways." Set in my ways. Like I was some old guy yelling at clouds instead of someone who'd literally taught himself how to fix commercial kitchen equipment using YouTube videos and prayer. "Lady," I said, and I could hear my voice getting that edge that Clara always warned me about, the one that meant I was about to say something I'd regret, but couldn't stop myself. I once fixed an industrial oven with a butter knife and duct tape during the dinner rush because we couldn't afford to close for repairs. I learned 3 different point-of-sale systems, figured out delivery app logistics during a pandemic, and managed staff across 5 locations with different health codes and municipal regulations. I'm adaptable as hell. Another pause. Then Brenda said, in that same overly sympathetic voice that made me want to reach through the phone, "I understand your frustration, and your experience is certainly impressive. But the decision has been made. I wish you the best of luck in your job search." Click. She hung up before I could respond. Probably because she'd had this conversation 1,000 times before with 1,000 other guys like me who'd suddenly realized that in America, there's an expiration date on your usefulness. And once you pass it, nobody wants to take a chance on slightly outdated milk even if it's still perfectly good. The bills started piling up like some kind of horrible Jenga tower where if one piece fell the whole thing would come crashing down. Mortgage payment due, car insurance, electric bill, water bill, internet bill because apparently even unemployment requires Wi-Fi. Zoe's orthodontist sent a reminder about her next appointment. The pharmacy called about Clara's prescription refill. The credit card company sent a cheerful email about our minimum payment. Every day the mailbox became this portal to fresh anxiety, just delivering new reasons to panic in convenient envelope form. Clara started rationing coffee filters, which might sound like a small thing, but was actually this huge symbol of how bad things were getting. She'd take a used filter, shake out the grounds, rinse it, and reuse it for the next pot. When I pointed out that we could afford coffee filters, she just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, "Can we though? Can we really afford anything right now?" And I didn't have an answer for that because she was right. We couldn't afford coffee filters. We couldn't afford anything. We were one unexpected car repair or medical emergency away from complete financial disaster. Our teenage daughter Zoe, bless her completely unfiltered teenage heart, tried to be helpful in the way that teenagers are helpful, which is to say not at all, but with good intentions. She was scrolling through TikTok one night while I was on the couch stress-eating cereal straight from the box, not even bothering with a bowl, because what's the point of dignity when you're unemployed? And she looked up with this expression like she'd just solved world hunger. "Dad," she said, "you should totally become an influencer. Like, seriously, you could call yourself the guy who got fired by his in-laws and make videos about how corporate America screws over loyal employees. People would eat that up. You'd go viral." I stared at her for a second, trying to figure out if she was joking or if this was a genuine suggestion from someone who'd grown up in a world where becoming internet famous was considered a viable career path. "So," I said slowly, "I'm 45 years old. Nobody wants to watch middle-aged men complain about their problems on the internet. That's what Facebook is for." She rolled her eyes in that way teenagers do when they think their parents are hopelessly out of touch. "You don't get it. Authenticity is huge right now. People are tired of fake influencers. They want real stories. You could totally make this work." I laughed, because what else was I going to do? But inside, I was one utility bill away from actually considering it. One more rejection letter away from filming myself ranting about nepotism and hoping the algorithm god smiled upon me. I was one bounce check away from auditioning for a heist movie, because at this point, robbing a bank seemed like it had better odds of success than finding legitimate employment. The American dream was officially dead, and I was standing at its funeral wondering if anyone would notice if I stole some of the flower arrangements to save money on our grocery bill. It was week 6 of unemployment, or as I'd started calling it, my extended vacation from dignity and regular meals, when I found myself doing what every desperate person does when they're drowning in bills and denial. Digging through old boxes in the basement looking for tax documents that might somehow save me. The IRS had sent one of those lovely letters that starts with, "We have questions about your 2023 return," and ends with the implied threat of federal prison, and I needed to find receipts and forms that I'd shoved into storage 3 years ago with the confident assumption that I'd never need them because surely my life couldn't get worse. Spoiler alert, life can always get worse, and it usually does right around tax season. The basement was exactly as depressing as you'd imagine. Concrete floor, exposed pipes that dripped occasionally for reasons I'd never bothered to investigate, and about 47 boxes of stuff we'd been meaning to sort through for the last decade, but never got around to because who has time to organize old memories when you're working 65 hours a week building someone else's empire? Most of the boxes were labeled in Clara's neat handwriting. Christmas decorations, Zoe baby clothes, kitchen stuff we never use. But then there were the unlabeled ones. The archaeological mystery boxes that could contain anything from important documents to a dead mouse. And you wouldn't know until you opened them and dealt with the consequences. I'd been at it for about 2 hours, covered in dust and regret, finding everything except what I actually needed. Old report cards from elementary school. A collection of VHS tapes that we no longer had a player for. 3 different sets of curtains we'd bought and never hung. a box of my dad's old tools that I'd inherited when he passed and hadn't been able to bring myself to use, because every time I picked up his hammer, I felt like I was somehow inadequate compared to the man who could fix anything with his bare hands and a can-do attitude from the 1970s. Then I found a box I didn't recognize, plain cardboard, no label, sealed with packing tape that had turned yellow and brittle. Inside were my mom's things, the stuff we'd packed up after she died 6 years ago, and I'd been too emotionally wrecked to sort through. Her reading glasses, a scarf that still somehow smelled like her perfume even after all this time. A recipe book where she'd written notes in the margins like, add more garlic, and Bob doesn't like onions. And at the bottom, underneath a stack of old greeting cards she'd saved, was a yellowed envelope with my name written in her handwriting. Marcus, Horizon Bank, 1985. I sat down on the cold basement floor and just stared at that envelope for a minute, because seeing her handwriting was like getting punched in the chest by a memory I'd buried. My mom had this way of writing my name where the M had this extra flourish, like she was signing a piece of art instead of addressing mail. I carefully opened the envelope, half expecting it to disintegrate in my hands like some kind of archaeological artifact, and inside was a savings passbook, the old-fashioned kind that banks don't even use anymore, with a blue cover and pages where they'd manually record deposits and withdrawals. I opened it and saw an entry from August 1985, written in my own 15-year-old handwriting that was somehow both neater and worse than my current penmanship. Initial deposit, $500. And then I remembered. Oh man, did I remember. It all came flooding back like one of those montage sequences in movies where everything suddenly makes sense. I'd just gotten my first real job working at Mr. Henderson's car wash on the weekends, making $6 an hour washing minivans and pickup trucks that smelled like wet dog and broken dreams. I'd saved up my first few paychecks and brought home $500 bills feeling like I was basically a Rockefeller. My mom had been so proud she'd actually cried, which at the time embarrassed me because I was 15 and couldn't understand why she was getting emotional about money. She'd sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table we'd eventually donated to Goodwill when we bought our house, and said, Marcus, we're going to open a savings account. This is important. Real men save before they spend. Your father and I, we want you to understand the value of putting something aside for the future. My dad had nodded along, adding his 2 cents. The earlier you start, the more it grows. It's like planting a tree, son. And so we'd gone to Horizon Bank, this little local place that doesn't even exist anymore. It got bought out by a bigger bank that got bought out by an even bigger bank until it eventually became some faceless corporate entity that probably has my money in a server somewhere. The teller had been this older woman named Dorothy who'd complimented my initiative and given me a lollipop like I was 7 instead of 15, but I'd taken it anyway because free candy is free candy regardless of your age. They'd given me this passbook and explained that I could make deposits whenever I wanted, watch my money grow with interest, build something for my future. And then I'd completely forgotten about it. Just totally forgot. Life happened. I graduated high school, went to community college, got my first apartment, met Clara, got married, had Zoe, started working for Dominic, and somewhere in all that chaos of just existing and surviving, that savings account slipped out of my memory like a dream you can't quite remember when you wake up. I'd probably made a few more deposits in those early years, but the passbook had ended up in my mom's stuff at some point and disappeared into the void of things you mean to deal with, but never do. I flipped through the pages and saw a few more entries from the late 80s. Small deposits, $20 here, $50 there, in my mom's handwriting. She'd been adding to it without telling me. The last entry was from 1992, $25 deposit. And then nothing, just blank pages and the accumulated dust of decades. I did some rough mental math and figured with 30+ years of whatever pathetic interest rate savings accounts offered, probably like 0.05%, or whatever joke number made banks feel generous, I maybe had $600 or $700 sitting in this account. Assuming the bank hadn't closed it for inactivity, assuming it still existed at all, $700 wasn't going to change my life or solve my unemployment crisis, but it was something. It was groceries for a month. It was the water bill and electric bill combined. It was a tiny life raft in an ocean of debt, and I was desperate enough to be grateful for it. I figured I'd go to the bank tomorrow, close the account before inflation laughed it out of existence, and use whatever was in there to buy us a little more time before we had to start making serious decisions about which bills to pay and which ones to apologetically ignore. I climbed back up the basement stairs holding that passbook like it was the Holy Grail, even though it probably contained the financial equivalent of pocket change. Clara was in the kitchen making dinner, or more accurately, making something dinner-adjacent out of whatever random ingredients we had left in the pantry, because grocery shopping had become this strategic military operation where we calculated the cost per meal of every item and still somehow ended up over budget. She looked up from whatever pasta situation she was creating and saw the expression on my face. "Please tell me you found something good in those boxes," she said, and I could hear the hope in her voice, which made me feel simultaneously better and worse because I was about to disappoint her with my modest discovery. "Define good," I said, holding up the passbook. "I found a savings account from 1985 that I totally forgot existed. My mom opened it with me when I got my first job. I think there might be $600 or $700 in there. Maybe." Clara's eyes widened slightly, and I could see her doing the same mental math I'd done, calculating which bills that could cover, which creditors we could temporarily appease. "That's not nothing," she said carefully, in the tone people use when they're trying to be optimistic about a situation that objectively sucks. "Every little bit helps, right?" I nodded and set the passbook on the counter, staring at it like it might suddenly reveal itself to contain more money through sheer force of wishful thinking. "I'm going to close this account tomorrow before inflation laughs it out of existence," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Whatever's in there, we'll use it for bills. Maybe buy some groceries that aren't just rice and sadness." Clara actually smiled at that, which was the first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. She walked over and looked at the passbook, running her finger over my mom's handwriting on the envelope. "Your mom would be proud," she said quietly. "She always wanted you to have something to fall back on." Then she looked at me with this expression that was half serious, half joking. "If they give you $700, we're going to Olive Garden. I want unlimited breadsticks and enough salad to feel fancy. We deserve one nice meal before we go back to eating like we're college students." I laughed, because the idea that $700 could make us feel rich enough for Olive Garden really put into perspective how far we'd fallen. But yeah, if that account had $700 in it, we were absolutely going to Olive Garden, and I was going to order whatever I wanted without looking at the prices, and we were going to pretend for one evening that life wasn't a complicated nightmare of bills and rejection letters. Tomorrow I'd go to Horizon Bank, or whatever it had become, and close out this little time capsule from my past. And if I was lucky, really lucky, it would buy us another month of pretending everything was going to be okay. Horizon Bank turned out to still exist, which was honestly more surprising than it should have been given how many local banks had been swallowed up by corporate mega institutions over the past few decades. It was tucked into a strip mall between a nail salon called Polish Palace and a sandwich shop that had changed names 4 times in the last 5 years, which is never a good sign for the structural integrity of their mayonnaise. The bank itself looked exactly like every small-town bank you've ever seen. Boring beige exterior, glass doors with too many stickers advertising services nobody actually wanted, and that particular smell inside that all banks have, like paper and air conditioning and people's slowly dying dreams. I walked in around 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, which I'd learned through 6 weeks of unemployment was the optimal time for running errands because everyone with an actual job was working, so there weren't any lines. The place was almost empty except for one older guy arguing with a teller about why he couldn't withdraw money from his wife's account, even though they'd been married for 40 years, which seemed like a fight he'd been having for most of those 40 years based on how tired both he and the teller looked. I took a number from one of those little ticket dispensers, even though I was literally the only other person waiting, because apparently following bureaucratic procedures is more important than common sense. My number got called approximately 45 seconds later, and I approached the counter where a woman in her late 20s sat behind bulletproof glass that had clearly seen better days. There were scratches and smudges that no amount of Windex could fix, like the glass itself had given up on maintaining appearances. Her name tag said Rebecca, and she had this expression that suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else, doing literally anything else, possibly including voluntary dental surgery without anesthesia. I recognized that look because I'd worn it myself for the last decade and a half every time Dominic asked me to work another double shift. "Hi," I said, sliding the ancient passbook through that little metal tray under the glass. I know this is going to sound weird, but I have this old savings account from 1985 that I completely forgot about, and I need to close it out. Rebecca picked up the passbook like I'd just handed her a historical artifact from a museum, which I guess in banking terms, I basically had. She turned it over in her hands, examining it with the kind of fascination usually reserved for finding out your phone is from 2010. Wow, she said, and I couldn't tell if she was impressed or horrified. This thing's ancient. Like seriously ancient. We don't even use these anymore. Are you sure you didn't bring this from a museum or something? She was smiling when she said it, so I figured she was trying to be friendly rather than insulting, though the line between those two things is often pretty thin when you're dealing with relics from your past. Yeah, I keep it right next to my dinosaur bones and my collection of cassette tapes, I said, because if I couldn't laugh at my own obsolescence, I'd probably start crying in the middle of this bank, and nobody needed that kind of scene on a Tuesday morning. Rebecca actually laughed, which made me feel slightly better about the whole situation. At least someone appreciated my self-deprecating humor. Even if that someone was a bank teller who looked like she was counting down the minutes until her lunch break. She typed something into her computer, squinted at the screen, typed some more, and then her eyebrows did this thing where they kind of scrunched together in confusion. Huh, she said, which is never what you want to hear from someone who's looking at your financial information. That's weird. My stomach did a little flip because in my experience, that's weird from a bank employee usually means you owe us money, or this account was closed for suspicious activity, or some other nightmare scenario that would perfectly cap off my recent streak of terrible luck. What's weird? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though internally I was preparing for the worst. Maybe the account had been closed decades ago and nobody told me. Maybe there were fees that had eaten away whatever balance was there. Maybe the bank had made a mistake and I actually owed them money somehow, because that would be just perfect for my current life situation. Rebecca shook her head and picked up her phone, the internal bank phone, not her personal one, and pressed a button. Hey Patricia, can you come out here for a second? I've got something I've never seen before and I need a manager to look at it. She said it loud enough that the other teller and the guy still arguing about his wife's account both looked over with interest, because apparently my financial business was about to become entertainment for everyone in this strip mall bank. A minute later, a woman emerged from the back office who looked like she'd been working in banking since before I was born. She was maybe in her mid-40s, wearing a professional pantsuit that had probably cost more than my current net worth, and had this air of calm competence that made me think she'd seen literally everything the banking world could throw at her and had come out the other side unimpressed. Her name tag said Patricia Chun, branch manager, and she approached Rebecca's station with the kind of measured walk that suggested this was probably going to be something routine that a newer teller just needed reassurance about. What's going on? Patricia asked, and Rebecca gestured at my passbook like it was evidence in a crime scene. This customer has an account from 1985 that's still active, but when I pulled it up, there's something attached to it that I've never seen before. Look at this. She turned her monitor slightly so Patricia could see, and I watched Patricia's face go through this interesting journey of expressions, mild curiosity, then confusion, then something that looked almost like shock, which was not reassuring to witness as the person whose account was causing this reaction. Patricia leaned closer to the screen, squinting at whatever information was displayed there. She clicked a few things with the mouse, scrolled, clicked some more, and then straightened up with this expression that I couldn't quite read. She looked at me, then back at the screen, then at me again like she was trying to reconcile what she was seeing with the slightly desperate-looking middle-aged guy standing in front of her in jeans and a hoodie that had a small coffee stain on the sleeve. "Sir," she said, and her voice had this careful quality to it, like she was trying not to freak me out, but also couldn't quite believe what she was about to tell me. "Can you come around to my office? I think we need to discuss this account in private." Private. That word sent my anxiety into overdrive, because nothing good ever happens in private bank offices. That's where they tell you about identity theft or frozen assets, or that clerical error that means you actually owe the IRS your firstborn child. I followed Patricia through a door that required her security badge to open, down a short hallway that smelled like burnt coffee and toner, and into a small office that was aggressively boring. Beige walls, generic motivational poster about teamwork, desk covered in neat stacks of papers that suggested she actually had her life together, unlike certain unemployed former restaurant managers. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, which was infinitely more comfortable than the folding chair Dominic had put me in when he fired me, and that felt like either a good sign or the universe setting me up for an even bigger fall. Patricia sat down, pulled up something on her computer, and then looked at me with this expression that was part professional courtesy and part genuine amazement. "Mr. Hale," she said, typing my account number into what looked like an ancient green screen system that probably ran on technology from the Reagan administration. "This account is definitely still active, but it's not just a savings account anymore. There's something attached to it that I haven't seen in my 20 years of banking." "What do you mean, attached to it?" I asked, and my voice came out higher than I intended because I was genuinely worried at this point. Maybe my parents had taken out a loan using the account as collateral. Maybe there was some kind of ancient banking fee that had been compounding for decades. My brain was running through every worst-case scenario it could manufacture on short notice. Patricia turned her monitor so I could see it. Not that I understood what I was looking at, because it was all numbers and codes and abbreviations that might as well have been written in ancient Sumerian. "Your parents," she said slowly, "set up what's called an automatic stock purchase plan linked to this savings account. Do you know what that means?" I shook my head, because I absolutely did not know what that meant, and my knowledge of the stock market was limited to knowing that it exists and sometimes goes up and sometimes goes down, and people on TV yell about it. Patricia leaned back in her chair with this look on her face like she was about to deliver news that would change my life, and I genuinely couldn't tell if it was good news or bad news or just weird news that would complicate my already complicated existence. "It means," she said, "that starting in 1985, a portion of the money in this account was automatically used to purchase shares of stock. Every month. For 40 years. She paused, and I could see her trying to figure out how to explain this to someone who clearly had no idea what was happening. "The stock they chose to buy, Mr. Hale, was Berkshire Hathaway." I stared at her. The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something I'd heard on the news or seen in a headline, but I couldn't place it. "Is that good?" I asked, feeling like an idiot, but genuinely having no clue if this was a disaster or not. Patricia actually smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from anyone in a professional setting in weeks. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly, "Berkshire Hathaway is the company owned by Warren Buffett, one of the most successful investors in history. And based on what I'm seeing here," she clicked a few more things on her screen, and I watched her eyes widen slightly. "You need to see this balance." She turned the monitor toward me again, and this time she pointed at a number on the screen. I looked at it, read it, blinked, read it again, and felt my entire understanding of reality shift sideways like someone had just rewritten the laws of physics. The number on that screen wasn't $600. It wasn't $700. It wasn't any number that made sense in the context of my broke, unemployed, desperately scraping by life. The number was $2.8 million. I'm pretty sure I stopped breathing for a solid 30 seconds, which in medical terms is probably not great, but in the context of finding out you're accidentally a millionaire, seems like a reasonable physiological response. My brain just completely shut down, like when you overload a circuit breaker and all the lights go out at once. I stared at that number, $2, 847, 392.67 to be exact, because apparently even my surprise windfall came with 67 cents just to make it extra specific, and try to make sense of it in the same way you try to make sense of waking up on Mars or discovering your dog could speak fluent Mandarin. "That can't be right," I finally managed to say, and my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside my body, like I was listening to a recording of myself having an existential crisis. "That's got to be a mistake. A glitch. Some kind of Y2K bug that never got fixed and just kept compounding errors until it invented money that doesn't exist." I was rambling, but Patricia just sat there with this patient expression that suggested she'd been expecting this exact reaction. "It's not a mistake," she said gently, in the tone you'd use with someone who just found out they won the lottery or survived a plane crash or any other life-altering event that breaks your brain. "I've checked it 3 times. This is legitimate. Your parents set up this stock purchase plan in 1985, and it's been running automatically ever since. Small amounts every month, buying fractional shares of Berkshire Hathaway stock. Over 40 years, with dividends reinvested and stock splits factored in. She gestured at the screen like it was self-explanatory, which it absolutely was not. I felt dizzy. Like genuinely physically dizzy, the kind where you need to hold on to something or risk falling over. I gripped the arms of the chair and tried to do math in my head, which was difficult because my brain was currently melting. 40 years. Monthly purchases. Berkshire Hathaway, which even I knew was Warren Buffett's company. The guy famous for being so rich and so good at investing that people literally studied his grocery shopping habits for financial advice. My parents, my dad who worked at the steel mill for 30 years and my mom who cleaned houses and did alterations on the side, had somehow set me up with stock in Warren Buffett's company, and I'd had no idea. Wait, I said, and a horrible thought occurred to me. Is there like a massive tax bill attached to this? Or fees? Or some kind of catch where I technically own it but can't access it without selling my organs or signing away my soul? Because nothing in my life had ever been straightforward, and I wasn't about to start believing in fairy tales now, even fairy tales involving accidentally becoming a millionaire. Patricia shook her head, and I could see she was trying not to smile at my paranoia, which was fair because I probably sounded insane. There are no outstanding fees or penalties. When you withdraw or sell shares, you'll owe capital gains tax, which will be substantial given the appreciation, but that's standard. This is your money, Mr. Hale. It's real, it's accessible, and it's been sitting here waiting for you for decades. She paused, then added, there's one more thing. Hold on. She got up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, one of those old-school metal ones that looked like it had survived several generations of bank managers, and pulled out a key ring that had approximately 40 keys on it, which seemed excessive, but I guess when you're managing other people's life savings, you need a lot of security. She unlocked the filing cabinet, pulled out a smaller locked box from inside it, unlocked that with a different key, and retrieved a sealed envelope that had gone yellow with age and had my name written on it in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. My mother's handwriting. That same flourish on the M that she always did, like my name was important enough to deserve calligraphy. Patricia handed me the envelope like it was fragile, which emotionally speaking, it absolutely was. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost couldn't open it, and I had to take a few deep breaths to steady myself enough to break the seal without ripping the paper. Inside was a letter, written on lined notebook paper that had been folded carefully and preserved all these years. The ink had faded slightly, but was still readable, and seeing my mother's handwriting again after 6 years of her being gone hit me like a freight train made of memories and regret. I had to blink a few times to clear my vision before I could actually read the words. Dear Marcus, she'd written, and I could practically hear her voice, that slight accent she'd never quite lost from growing up in a Polish neighborhood in Chicago. If you're reading this, life has probably kicked you around a bit. We know you, sweetheart. You're loyal to a fault. You work yourself to the bone for people who might not appreciate it. You put everyone else first and yourself last. Your father and I, we set this up so that when you're down, not if, but when, because life kicks everyone eventually, you'll have a soft place to land. I had to stop reading for a second because my eyes were doing this thing where they were producing way more moisture than was professionally appropriate for a bank office. Patricia silently pushed a box of tissues across her desk, which suggested she'd been through this kind of scene before, or at least had anticipated that reading letters from dead parents might cause emotional reactions. I took a tissue, composed myself, and kept reading. We heard about a man named Warren Buffett on the television one night. Your father was flipping channels and stopped on some business program. You know how he likes to yell at the news. This Buffett fellow was talking about patience, about investing for the long term, about how real value isn't built overnight. Your father looked at me and said, Rose, that's us. We're patient people. And I thought, why not? Why not take the little money you worked so hard for and put it somewhere that believes in the long game? There was a paragraph break, and then the handwriting got smaller, like she was trying to fit more onto the page. Every $5 we sent to this account was something we gave up, a meal out that we skipped, a pair of shoes I mended instead of replaced, walking to the store instead of driving to save on gas. Your father kept saying we should tell you, but I wanted it to be a surprise. A good surprise when you needed it most. Remember, Marcus, true value takes time. It's not flashy. It doesn't announce itself. It just grows, quietly, one small sacrifice at a time, until one day it becomes something that can change your life. At the bottom, in my dad's handwriting, that blocky, practical penmanship he had from filling out work orders for 30 years, was a postscript, still adding $10 a month. Son, even though your mother says we should tell you about this now. She says I'll lose this argument. Buffett says patience pays. Your mother says patience plus surprises pays better. I'm guessing I lost that argument. Love you, kid. Dad. I set the letter down on Patricia's desk because I couldn't hold it anymore without getting tears all over it. And I just sat there trying to process what I'd just read. My parents, who'd never owned more than one car at a time, who'd shopped at discount stores and clipped coupons and made everything stretch as far as it could possibly go, had been quietly, methodically, building me a safety net out of their own sacrifices. $5 here, $10 there. Money they could have spent on themselves, on making their own lives easier, but instead had funneled into this account linked to a stock purchase plan that they probably didn't fully understand but believed in because some guy on TV had talked about patience and long-term thinking. When did they stop making deposits? I asked, my voice coming out hoarse and strange. Patricia checked her screen, scrolling through what I assumed was decades of transaction history. The last deposit was in January 2019, she said quietly. $10. 5 months before. She trailed off, not finishing the sentence, but she didn't need to. 5 months before my dad had a heart attack at the steel mill and died before the ambulance even arrived. 5 months before everything fell apart, and I'd spent the next year just trying to keep my mom from falling apart. Until she'd followed him 6 months later because apparently they'd decided 45 years together wasn't enough, and death wasn't going to separate them for long. They never told me, I said, more to myself than to Patricia. All those years, they were doing this, and they never said a word. I could have helped them. I could have contributed more. I stopped, because I realized what I was saying didn't make sense. They hadn't wanted my help. They'd wanted to help me. This wasn't about them needing money. This was about them making sure I'd be okay when they weren't around to take care of me anymore. Patricia printed out the full account statement. It took several pages, and slid it across the desk. Mr. Hale, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like genuine admiration. In 20 years of banking, I've never seen anything like this. Most people who build wealth do it through high salaries, inheritance, business success. Your parents did it through pure discipline and sacrifice. $5 to $10 a month, every single month, for almost 40 years. They bought Berkshire Hathaway when it was trading for around $1,500 a share. Today it's worth over $700,000 per share. $700,000 per share. And my parents had been buying fractional shares every month for 4 decades. I tried to do the math, but my brain couldn't handle it. All I could think about was my dad walking to work to save gas money, my mom taking in alterations and sewing late into the night. The times they'd said no to family vacations or restaurant dinners or new furniture because they were being practical. Practical. They'd been building me a fortune out of their practicality, and I'd never known. I looked at Patricia, then down at the letter, then at the statement showing $2.8 million in an account I'd forgotten existed. My parents, who'd never owned more than one car at a time, who'd lived in the same small house for 30 years and thought getting cable TV was an extravagance, had quietly built me a safety net that Warren Buffett himself would approve of. They'd given me exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it, without ever asking for credit or recognition. Can I get a copy of this letter? I asked Patricia, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded and carefully made a photocopy, handing me both the original and the copy. I folded the original back into the envelope and held it against my chest like it might disappear if I let go. I had come to this bank expecting maybe $700. Instead, I got $2.8 million and the realization that my parents had loved me more than I'd ever fully understood. I went home from the bank in a daze, driving on autopilot while my brain tried to reconcile the fact that I'd walked in expecting enough money for maybe a fancy dinner at Olive Garden and walked out with enough to buy the entire Olive Garden franchise if I wanted to, which I didn't, because I'd learned my lesson about working for other people's restaurant dreams. When I pulled into the driveway, Clara was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee. The good coffee, not the cheap stuff we'd been rationing, which meant she'd caved and bought the expensive beans, probably figuring that if we were going broke anyway, We might as well do it with decent caffeine. She took one look at my face and set down her mug so fast it almost tipped over. What happened? Is the account frozen? Do we owe money? Marcus, you look like you've seen a ghost. I couldn't even form words at first. I just handed her the bank statement and watched her face go through the same journey mine had. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and then this weird laughing, crying thing that happens when your brain can't process reality anymore and just starts making random sounds. This is real, she whispered, staring at the number like it might rearrange itself into something more believable. This is actually real money that we can use? I nodded, still not quite trusting my voice, and then showed her the letter from my parents. She read it right there on the porch, and by the time she finished, we were both crying like idiots while our neighbor Mr. Peterson pretended not to watch from behind his newspaper, even though we all knew he was totally watching because Mr. Peterson watched everything that happened on our street like it was his personal reality show. That night, after we'd called our accountant, who nearly had a heart attack and immediately started talking about tax strategies and trusts and a bunch of financial jargon that went over my head, Clara and I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine that we'd been saving for a special occasion, which this definitely qualified as. "So what are you going to do?" she asked, refilling both our glasses with the kind of generous pour that suggested we were celebrating properly. "Are you going to retire? Travel? Buy a boat? Start collecting expensive watches like every other middle-aged guy having a midlife crisis?" I thought about it for a minute, swirling the wine in my glass and trying to figure out what I actually wanted now that financial desperation wasn't making all my decisions for me. "I want to open a restaurant," I said, and Clara nearly spit out her wine. "Hear me out?" I continued before she could start listing all the reasons that was insane. Not like Dominic's places. Not some empire-building nightmare where we're chasing trends and hashtags. Something small, real. A place where the food actually matters more than the Instagram potential. Clara set down her glass and gave me that look, the one that meant she was trying to figure out if I'd lost my mind or if this was actually a reasonable idea. "You just spent 15 years getting destroyed by the restaurant business," she said slowly. "And your first instinct with life-changing money is to jump back into the exact industry that kicked your teeth in?" She had a point, but I shook my head because she wasn't quite getting what I meant. "It's different this time," I said, leaning forward with the kind of intensity that probably made me look slightly unhinged, but I didn't care. "This time it's mine. My rules, my vision, my choice of who I work with and how I run things." I tracked her down through mutual connections and found her working at a nursing home kitchen, completely overqualified, but needing steady income after Dominic had blackballed her in the local restaurant community. "Marcus Hale," she said when I called her, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I heard what happened to you. Dominic's an idiot. What can I do for you?" When I explained that I was opening my own place and wanted her as head chef with full creative control and a salary that actually reflected her experience, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "When do I start?" Just like that. No negotiation, no hesitation. She trusted me because I'd been the only person at Dominic's who'd ever stood up for her, who'd argued that quality mattered more than speed, even though I'd lost those arguments. Next, I hired Luis Rodriguez, a 61-year-old dishwasher who knew more about kitchen mechanics than most professional repairmen. Luis had worked at the third Ferraro location until Luca decided they should optimize labor costs by hiring younger workers who'd accept minimum wage and no benefits. Luis had been there for 12 years, showing up every single day, fixing things that broke, keeping that kitchen running, and got thanked with a pink slip and a speech about the business needing to evolve. I found him working 2 part-time jobs, one at a car wash, one at a grocery store, trying to make ends meet until Social Security kicked in. "You sure about this?" Luis asked when I offered him the job, with benefits and a wage that wouldn't require him to work 70 hours a week to survive. "You know I'm old, right?" Not exactly the demographic Luca was looking for. I told him that was exactly why I wanted him, because he understood that good work wasn't about being trendy. It was about showing up and doing the job right, day after day, without expecting a medal for basic competence. I wasn't building someone else's dream anymore. I wasn't sacrificing my life for a man who thought yelling in Italian made him authentic. I was building something that had my parents' names on the window and their values baked into every decision. It was a Wednesday afternoon, That weird dead zone between lunch and dinner when restaurants take a collective breath before the evening chaos starts. I was in the kitchen seasoning a massive pot of pasta sauce. Martha's recipe, not Dominic's, because Martha actually knew the difference between good marinara and whatever shortcut garbage Dominic had been passing off as traditional. When Sarah poked her head through the kitchen door with this expression on her face that I'd learned meant trouble. Not health inspector trouble or angry customer trouble, but the kind of trouble that required my immediate attention and possibly diplomatic skills. "Marcus," she said, lowering her voice even though the kitchen was loud enough that nobody could hear us anyway over the sound of Luis scrubbing down the flat-top grill while singing along to whatever Spanish radio station he had playing. "There's someone here to see you, and you're not going to believe who it is." The way she said it, with this mix of amusement and disbelief, made my stomach do a little flip because I'd learned that surprise visitors in restaurants usually meant either very good news or very bad news, with no middle ground. I wiped my hands on my apron. A nice apron, not one of those cheap ones that Dominic had ordered in bulk with the restaurant logo printed crooked, and followed Sarah out to the dining room. And there, sitting in one of our corner booths looking like he'd aged about 10 years and 6 months, was Luca Ferraro. He was wearing what I'm sure he considered casual clothes. Designer jeans that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payment. A fitted button-down shirt that screamed, "I shop at stores where they offer you champagne." And shoes that were trying way too hard to look casual, but clearly cost a fortune. But none of that expensive clothing could hide the fact that he looked tired, stressed, and distinctly uncomfortable sitting in my restaurant. I took a second to just appreciate the moment, because life doesn't give you many opportunities to see the person who helped ruin your life sitting in your establishment looking like they needed something from you. It was like winning a small lottery made entirely of schadenfreude and cosmic justice. I walked over to his booth, making sure my footsteps were loud enough that he'd have time to prepare whatever speech he'd rehearsed. Because you don't show up at your former employee's restaurant 6 months after firing him without having prepared some kind of pitch. "Luca," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional even though internally I was doing a victory dance. "This is unexpected. Can I get you something to eat? Coffee? A reality check?" Okay, that last part slipped out, but I figured I'd earned the right to a little sarcasm given our history. Luca looked up at me with this expression that was trying to be confident but came across as more desperate than anything else, like a kid trying to negotiate his way out of being grounded. "Marcus," he said, and I could hear him trying to find the right tone. Not quite apologetic, not quite friendly, landing somewhere in the weird middle ground of corporate politeness. "Can you sit? I need to talk to you about something." He gestured at the seat across from him like he was inviting me to sit in my own restaurant, which was rich considering 6 months ago, he'd been explaining to me how I was too old to understand TikTok. I slid into the booth because I was curious what kind of disaster had brought him to my door, and also because I wanted to watch him squirm up close. "How's business?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer because the restaurant community in Cleveland isn't that big, and word travels fast when things are falling apart. I'd heard through the grapevine, specifically through Martha, who still had friends at the Ferraro locations, that things weren't going well. Turns out that replacing experienced staff with younger, cheaper workers who looked good in photos but didn't know how to actually run a restaurant had consequences. Who knew? Luca shifted uncomfortably, and I watched him try to figure out how to spin disaster into something that sounded less catastrophic. "It's been challenging," he said, which is corporate speak for "everything is on fire and I don't know how to put it out." "The industry is tough right now. We're pivoting our strategy, trying some new approaches." More corporate buzzwords. I almost felt bad for him, watching him try to use business school language to describe the fact that he'd driven his father's restaurant empire into the ground faster than anyone thought possible. "Look," Lucas said, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the table in what I'm sure he thought was a sincere gesture. "I'm going to be straight with you. My father, he wants to talk. Things haven't been going as planned with the new direction. We've had to close 3 locations in the last 4 months. The remaining 2 are..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Struggling. Dad thinks maybe we moved too fast with the changes. He's willing to hire you back. Management position. Name your price. Full benefits. Whatever you want." I let that sit in the air for a moment, just to make him uncomfortable, while I looked around at my restaurant. It was the between service lull, but I could see everything we'd built. The regulars at the counter having their afternoon coffee and pie, Martha visible through the kitchen window working on dinner prep, Luis fixing something under a sink, because something always needed fixing and he handled it without drama. The walls covered in photos of real people and real moments instead of manufactured Instagram aesthetics. This place was full, not just with customers, but with purpose, with dignity, with people who'd been told they weren't good enough and had proven everyone wrong. Luca, I said slowly, making sure every word landed with the weight I intended. Let me see if I understand this correctly. Your father fired me because I was too old, too slow, too irrelevant to understand modern restaurant marketing. You specifically told me that the demographic you wanted didn't want to see someone's dad trying to be cool. You brought in younger staff, pushed out everyone with experience, turned everything into a social media circus. And now that it's all falling apart, you want me to come back and fix it? Name my price. He had the decency to look embarrassed, at least. His ears turned red, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes. It was a business decision, he said weakly. Nothing personal. Those same words his father had used. Nothing personal. Like destroying someone's livelihood and financial security was just another line item on a spreadsheet, no different from ordering supplies or adjusting the menu. I leaned back in the booth and gestured around the dining room. You see this place? 6 months ago, I was unemployed, desperate, and being told by people like you that I was obsolete. Now I've got lines around the block. Food critics writing reviews that use words like soulful and authentic, actual authenticity, not the fake kind your dad tried to sell by yelling in Italian. My staff are people your father threw away. Martha, who was too slow. Luis, who was too old. Jamie, who had the audacity to ask about fair wages. Sarah, who wasn't young and cute enough for your brand. We built this together, and nobody here is going to be fired because some trust fund kid with a business degree decided they're not relevant enough. Luca opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. 6 months of satisfaction had been building up, and this moment was too perfect to rush. Tell your dad thanks for the offer. Really, it's almost flattering that after spending 15 years as his free labor, after being told I was too old to understand the modern world, he's now willing to admit he needs me. But I'm going to pass. See, I'm too old for his business. Turns out I'm just the right age for mine. Though those definitely helped and paid for Zoe's college without loans, which would make my parents incredibly proud. What that account really bought me was perspective. It taught me that value isn't built overnight with hashtags and influencer partnerships. It's built slowly, deliberately, with patience and sacrifice that nobody sees until suddenly everyone does. Because the truest investment my parents ever made wasn't in Berkshire Hathaway stock or compound interest or Warren Buffett's genius. It was in me. In teaching me that real worth takes time, that loyalty matters when it's given to the right people, and that sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen because it forces you to build something actually worth having. Thanks, Mom and Dad. The restaurant's packed tonight. I think you'd be proud.